Conversation with a Geographer. I'm Mike DeVivo, professor of geography at Grand Rapids Community College, and today we're very fortunate to have Michael Prentice, professor of geography at the University of North Alabama. Mike, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Mike. It's a great honor to be here and a pleasure too.
Well, thank you for those kind words as well. Like I start many of these, I ask people who are being interviewed to reflect upon their backgrounds and to consider what sparked their interest to pursue geography. Can you comment perhaps on your childhood and reflect upon some of your childhood years, your adolescence perhaps, and what might have intrigued you about geography and your studies later?
Well, my path to geography was very roundabout and long, even compared to many other geographers. But here's how it goes. I was born in San Francisco and grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area in the area called the Peninsula, in a town called San Carlos. It's about halfway between San Francisco and San Jose, the very northern fringe of Silicon Valley. So it's a very cosmopolitan area, a lot of different cultures represented there. And then my father's family is Spanish. They were immigrants a little over 100 years ago. They were migrant farm laborers in Hawaii and California. My mother was herself born in Czechoslovakia, was an immigrant herself. So I had this kind of cosmopolitan family that had these global connections and different languages spoken in the home and things like that. And so I had this environment that was very culturally and globally rich, but I wasn't going anywhere. I had really few opportunities to travel. My father was an officer in the California Highway Patrol, and he patrolled a motorcycle every day. And so the last thing he wanted to do was take his family on a vacation where he had to drive, because that's what he was doing all the time. So we didn't do any of their classic family road trips. We did typically just things locally in the San Francisco area, a lot of visits to museums. My favorite was the California Academy of Science, which is the natural history museum for the Bay Area. And it had these big halls with painted landscapes and dioramas with stuffed animals in them. And it was very exotic and mysterious. And it also intrigued me and inspired me more to want to travel somewhere else beyond the confines of California. And so when I went to college, I was the first person in my family to attend college. I started out at a community college. It was the College of San Mateo, our local community. Then it ultimately transferred to the University of California at Berkeley. But my major was political science. I chose that major because to me at the time, it seemed to be the most international and the most travel-oriented major, with things like current events and politics in different parts of the world and geopolitics and things like that. It seemed to me to be a very internationally focused major. I didn't know about geography then. I didn't know that that was something you could study in college, or I probably could have chosen that, but I didn't. So I went with political science. And then I graduated from Berkeley and went on to do a master's degree at Northwestern University in Chicago, at Evanston, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. I chose that because when I was an undergraduate studying political science, I got very intrigued with Africa as a region. I'm not sure why that was. It may have been because everyone else I knew was focusing on Latin America or Middle East or Asia, and Africa was the one that nobody touched. And so that intrigued me the most, that it was the most obscure. And so I chose Africa. I had good mentors at Berkeley who were African politics specialists. I went on to Northwestern because that was the oldest and largest and sort of most prominent program in the United States that had African studies. They had the Melville Herskovits Africana Library. It's the biggest African material in the world. So it was the ideal place to go for African studies. So I did my master's degree in political science again. I did a graduate certificate in African studies while I was there. But traveling to Africa was problematic at that time. It was the mid-1980s. There was a lot of conflict going on. It was expensive. So I had a professor at Northwestern, Barry Farrell, and he lured me towards Canada and said, well, if what about Canada as a place? Obviously not quite the same as Africa, but it was also appealing to me as a place, that seemed mysterious. And so I seized that opportunity, and through his help, I was able to move to Calgary, Alberta, and ended up teaching political science at the University of Calgary. And the University of Calgary hosted the Arctic Institute of North America, which is Canada's big polar studies center. And so I ended up becoming affiliated with that, working with some colleagues there, traveling a lot in Alaska, Yukon Territory, Northwest Territories, and really becoming deep into Arctic studies.
That's about as far from Africa as you can get.
Pretty much in every possible way. But it was still kind of exotic going up there in the north to places like the Yukon and Northwest Territory. Great experience doing that for several years. And I had heard about this opportunity to go to the Scott Polar Research Institute, which is at the University of Cambridge in England. And it was Britain's big polar studies institute. So through some connections, I was able to become a visiting scholar there for about 3 months and lived in Cambridge, met a lot of different people at that time. And then while I was there, I heard about this conference that was taking place in Finland. And the announcement said that if you pay your way to Finland, they will pay for all your expenses there, including some local travel and field trips and things like that. So being a kind of gypsy scholar without a lot of income, I thought this is a great opportunity to see a country I'd never been to. And so I went to that conference. I met some folks there who were part of this Arctic Center that was being developed at the University of Lapland in the Lapland province of Finland, in the Rovaniemi. Right on the Arctic Circle it was located. And they were just building this place that wasn't even physically constructed yet. And they talked to me about, my experiences when they found out that I had spent, 3 months at the Scott Polar Research Institute in England, as well as 3 years at the Arctic Institute of North America. They said, hey, Mike, would you like to come and spend 3 months with us in Rovaniemi, Finland, and help us, build up this center with your foreign experiences and give some advice? And I said, sure. I jumped on that opportunity as well, went up there for 3 months. Well, that 3 months ended up being 5 years. They just kept asking me to stay longer. I ended up doing research there with colleagues. And this is all leading up to geography, because most of the people that I was working with at the Arctic Center or had interactions with at the university were geographers. And I realized that they were doing all this cool stuff that you couldn't do in political science. Political science had really 5 subfields of kind of narrowly confined little space, where geography was everything, as you know. No matter what you did, it was geography somehow. And so as a person who likes to jump around different places, different topics, and kind of dabble in this and that, that was my moment of epiphany that this was my true field, was geography. So it took a long time. It took a lot of moving around, but I ended up in geography, as I guess I was ultimately destined to do.
It took you a trip to Finland to get into geography. And I've worked with Finnish geographers in Africa. They're great Africanists, from the University of Oulu, for example. They've done some excellent work. So you got into geography, and so
I did, finally. Took a while.
So from Finland, you then went to Canberra. Is that?
Not directly. Nothing I do is ever really very direct. I was getting there. So while I was in Finland, and if you want to come back to this later, maybe that would be a better opportunity when we talk about field work and stuff. But I did a lot of work in Russia, or Soviet Union as it was then. I was there during that transitional period, the last 3 years of the Soviet Union and the first 2 years of independent Russia. We'll come back to that in a minute. But after I left Finland, after 5 years, I really had enough of all my daylight coming in one big 4-month installment in the summer, and all of my darkness coming in one big 4-month installment in the winter. I wanted an even split. And it's kind of a harsh life when you live that far north on the Arctic Circle, adjusting to the daylight. So I decided to come back to the United States, went back to California for a little while, then ended up through some people I'd met at an AAG conference, working at the University of New Mexico. And I taught geography there. I didn't have a degree in geography, didn't have really any experience teaching geography, but they just sort of said, well, here's your class. It meets at this time. Just go there and teach world regional geography. And so I figured it out. I went there. I taught world regional geography. I loved it. Loved teaching geography, sharing geographic experiences, helping people understand that there's a bigger world out there. And so I decided I need to do a PhD in this field in order to get a permanent academic position. And so I had been to a lot of different conferences, and I had met people from different places, and I met a lot of Australians. And they were always really energetic, as you know, Australians are, and kind of very excited about things. And they talked to me a lot about geography. And so I thought, well, I should go to study in Australia. You know, the British Commonwealth has a big heritage of geography as a major field of study. When you ruled a global empire, you had to have geographic knowledge. So unlike the United States, where many departments have closed and programs have been inactivated or minimized, in Commonwealth countries, geography is a huge field and a lot of practitioners. So I was going to go to Australia, and the person who I knew the best there was named John Lee. He's a professor of geography and planning at the University of Sydney. And so I thought I would go and work with him. But he said, no, what I would suggest to you is you go to the Australian National University, ANU, in Canberra, the capital of Australia. They have a better program in geography, as he said, for my interests. And he urged me to do that. I had met people from the ANU at these conferences, and they also urged me to apply. I did. I was accepted into the program. I got full funding. I went to Canberra and spent 4 amazing years living in Australia, which is in some ways like a fantasy version of California in a lot of ways. It's sort of like what a lot of Californians would wish that California still looked like. And so I love living in Australia, had a great experience there, and started, initially my project was to compare northern Canada, where I'd spent a lot of time, with the Australian outback, and look at issues like indigenous populations, land claims and land rights, things like resource extraction, remoteness and marginality, peripheral economies, things like that, all these commonalities. And I started out doing that. And our university, ANU, had a big field station, and it was up in Darwin, in the top end of Northern Territory. And so I went there, spent several months there, was getting all set up for my dissertation. And then the university, for some reason, budget cuts or something else, it was always very vague, they decided to close that field station and close the library that was attached to it and the housing that came with it. So that threw a huge wrench in my plans. So I looked for an alternative, ended up focusing on Pacific islands. So I looked at small Pacific islands, including countries like Nauru, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Tonga. And I sort of shifted my interests over. I was interested in looking at economic development strategies and how these marginal regions, or marginal so-called, really survive and how they can prosper. And so I shifted that interest from Northern Australian outback to Pacific Islands, which were in some ways equally remote from centers of global finance and economics and markets, and however you want to define marginality. And so I ended up doing my dissertation on those small Pacific Island countries, looking at sovereign wealth funds and how those small island nations, and I also included Alaska and Alberta as marginalized spaces with sovereign wealth funds as well. I looked at how these places had set up these sovereign wealth funds or trust funds that managed resource revenues and then invested them in global financial markets that produced this economic return that, in a sense, demarginalized those places, because now they weren't just simple recipients of foreign investment. They were actually players in the international financial market as investors. And so that was a strategy towards prosperity in these remote places, and a very successful one in most cases. So that's what I ended up doing as my dissertation, and had those 4 great years in Australia and got to do field work in some of those island countries.
That sounds wonderful. So you went to Nauru?
I did, yes, I did.
And you went to Fiji?
I did, yes. Fiji was not a country included in my study, but it was a big hub, as you know, for the South Pacific. That's where the big airport is. Everything has to connect out of there. So yeah, Nauru, Tuvalu, and Kiribati were the 3 countries I looked at most closely. Tonga to some extent, but it was a little more difficult to get information. And then Fiji was kind of a stopping point on those.
I mean, it's a fascinating region. It really is. You
And
were really
very different from the Arctic and from Africa.
well.
But
You were very blessed to be able to shift so drastically at that time as well. Not every program allows one to shift right away. So you had some very understanding supervisors and professors for sure.
I did. It was a very accommodating program. And I just mentioned, how those regions strike one as being very different from each other. We think of the Arctic region and Lapland and Alaska and the Yukon compared to Pacific Islands or the tropical north end of Australia. But in some ways, there's remarkable similarities.
Sure.
They're both isolated places. Many times the only way to travel around is by air because there's no roads or things like railroads. There are places where you have to fly into a remote village. There are extremes of weather. They're prone to natural disasters. The resource extraction is the major thing. There's still unsettled indigenous land claims. Those are all things that are commonalities in these multiple regions.
Well, no, it's certainly fascinating. That's for sure. And so you left Australia, came to the U.S., and once you
did. I had a one-year position teaching at the University of Hawaii, Hilo campus on the Big Island.
On the Big Island. That's a very wet part of the Big Island, too.
It is. It's 150 to 180 inches of rain a year, but it was nice being in a tropical rainforest. My grandfather was actually born in Hawaii, and in a village there in the Hamakua Coast, and I ended up living about 5 miles away from his birthplace in a little village called Honomu, population 400. And I lived in a little worker's cottage built entirely out of redwood, so it was a cool experience. After that, I went back to California for a year, and then on to a very different kind of place from Hawaii, the University of Central Missouri, near Kansas City. And then when I was looking for that tenure track position, there weren't a whole lot of openings in my area of specialization, political, economic, cultural geography. And so the one that was there was the University of North Alabama in Florence, Alabama. I applied. I'd never been to Alabama before in my life. Growing up in California, I never thought I would ever live in the South. And was interviewed, liked the place, liked the colleagues, liked the university, liked the town. It was this very typical Main Street, small American town. And got the job, and I've been here 18 years.
18 years in Florence, Alabama. Wow. Well, you've certainly made a name for yourself, though, in northern Alabama, in academia. You are really, really exemplifying in many ways what a good geographer can do in a public regional institution. You have taught so many different courses, and this also shows how your eclectic interests can be revealed to students through different kinds of courses. Talk about some of the courses that you've taught that wouldn't be considered traditional geography courses.
Well, the reason I've taught so many different courses, and I think at last count, I've taught 46 or 47 different courses, and most of those multiple times, and some of them, for 20 or 30 years. And the reason is because I teach 4 classes each semester. I typically teach 2 classes in summer and another one in winter, so typically 11 classes a year. So that's a lot of opportunities to teach different classes, and one needs to think up new ones to be a little more lively and exciting instead of teaching the same thing over and over. So in addition to your classic, original, traditional geography classes like World Regional Geography, which, by the way, is my favorite class to teach, human geography, political geography, economic geography, business geography, I've created a bunch of different new classes. One is the geography of beer, wine, and spirits. Another one is, I'm teaching right now, it's called Tchaikovsky to Tupac, the geography of world music. I've taught classes on national parks and protected areas. I've taught a class called War in Afghanistan. It was team taught with a colonel in the United States Army, and we taught that class when the U.S. was still involved in Afghanistan to alert students to what was going on and the historical background to that conflict. I've taught a lot of field courses in places like the American West. I've taken students on those trips to places like New Mexico, Colorado, Yellowstone National Park. I've done a field course to Chicago. I've done field courses, study abroad courses to China, to Peru. So I've done a lot of courses in the classroom as well as beyond.
Well, comment on those field courses a bit more, if you don't mind, because it seems like the field courses are losing their position in many geography undergraduate programs, oftentimes considered an elective or sometimes just discarded altogether. Even field trips in classes are very difficult to administer in some institutions because of liability reasons. Would you just elaborate on a couple of experiences associated with your field courses, but also why it's so important to keep them included in the geography curriculum?
Well, you're right, Mike. I think that field courses or field trips or any kind of experience like that is absolutely crucial to our mission as geography educators. I always tell students that geography is all that stuff outside that you see out the window there, and you need to get out there and actually look at it. And so field courses are part of that, especially here in the South. I teach at a small public university. Most of the students come from the local area. Many of them have a rural background or an economically disadvantaged background, and they haven't traveled very much at all. I'm growing up in California, where my friends would go to Europe and people would go to different states and things like that. It was kind of shocking to come here and have so many students tell me that they've never been on an airplane, and they're in their mid-20s, and they've never been outside the South. The furthest west they've ever been is Memphis, and the furthest north they've been is Nashville or something. And if they have been outside the South or to another country, it's been on a cruise to Cancun or something, which is not the same kind of experience in terms of what you would like them to see of the world. So in a place like this, especially, those field courses are absolutely essential to teaching geography. We have education abroad and we have study away. And study away is the same kind of thing, but it's a domestic experience. So the students don't need a passport. Their parents aren't worried about them getting sick from drinking the water and that kind of thing. So we've done a lot to the American West. We've taken students out on multiple trips, driving in vans. We had one year we had 43 students, and let me tell you that that's about 30 too many, but it worked. We had 4 vans. We were just convoying across, the Midwest and Oklahoma, and reached New Mexico and went up to Colorado and up into Wyoming and into Utah and Arizona. And the students most of them had never been to places like this, and they were completely shocked by what they saw. They couldn't believe this was America. They saw mountains and deserts, and they went into restaurants and asked for sweet tea and were told that there's the unsweet tea and just put sugar packets in it to make sweet tea. And they were taken aback by that, astonished by these things. And so from a physical geography perspective and from a human geography perspective, it was a completely different experience for most of our students. And it got them really fired up about how they wanted to go back and see more of these things and go on their own with their friends and explore and go down these back roads and kind of take a more leisurely time. The same when we took students to a place like Chicago, which I did last year. Of the students we took, hardly any of them, only one of them had ever been to Chicago, and only a handful had ever been to like a city bigger than Nashville. And so Chicago was a totally different world. And especially down here in the South, a lot of the media portrays Chicago as being a very, dangerous place and dysfunctional place. That's the kind of media image you get in down here in Alabama. And so we took students there, and we flew, we took public transit everywhere. We stayed in the center of the city, went out to different neighborhoods, looked at neighborhood change, and we walked around a lot. We walked around at night in the center of Chicago, and the students were like, whoa, I don't see any dysfunctionality here. I don't see any problems. So it opened their eyes to the fact that sometimes the media distorts the perceptions we have of places. And they realized that the way to find out about it is to do what Aristotle told his famous student, Alexander the Great, go and see for yourself. And so that's what education abroad and study away is all about. I'll tell you about another trip, a study abroad, education abroad experience. It was to Peru. And I was teaching a world regional geography class, had a really good student. His name's Hayden. And he sat in the front row, very engaged student. He was a local student, never been on an airplane, never been outside the South, came from a kind of rural background, and was a Spanish major. And he'd chosen Spanish because he'd taken some classes in high school, and he was really good at learning a language and thought he'll go on and be a Spanish teacher in the local high school or something. That was his vision of his future. So every day he came to class, he sat in the front row, very engaged student. I was always like, Hayden, we're doing this study abroad to Peru. You should come along because it will give you a chance to practice Spanish and, get an experience in a different country, and you'll learn more about geography, and maybe you'll become a geography major after all. As I was trying to get him to do. Mm-hmm. He's like, no, I'm not interested at all in traveling to foreign countries. I don't have any interest in traveling outside the U.S. And I was like, no, you got to go. And so he kept saying, no, I don't want to go. He had the money because he worked a bunch of jobs and he was a good saver and his parents would have supported it anyway. He just didn't want to go. He wasn't interested. So finally, I talked him into it. It took a lot of arm twisting, but after, I can be pretty persistent. And so I persisted, and eventually he gave up and said, okay, I'll go on this trip just so you can stop pestering me. So he went on the trip. He was a little nervous about it. First time on an airplane, it was a long way to go. First time outside the South, being away from home for two and a half weeks. The first time he'd been away from home for probably more than a day. And so all these different kind of things. Went on the trip. We arrive in Peru. He immediately takes to it very well. He starts speaking Spanish very hesitantly to the locals. They reply. He enters in conversations with them, and he's like, whoa, I'm speaking Spanish and they understand me. How cool is that? We did all these different things in the country. We went to Machu Picchu, of course, but we looked at the indigenous heritage of Quechua in Cusco. We looked at the coastal environment. We did hiking. We ate different kinds of food. We all ate guinea pig, cuy, as you know, a lot of other things like that. And he was very brave in trying all that sort of stuff. And so he had a great time on this trip, as did the other students. We come back from the trip, and the next week when he comes back to class, he says, you know what? I'm going to add geography as a second major. And my goal now is to travel to every country in the world, beginning with all the Spanish-speaking countries. So you may have heard, people talk about how study abroad and field experiences are transformational. And it sounds cliched and hackneyed. Well, he was a good example of where it really was true. A student who didn't want to travel, who didn't want to enlarge his horizons, but took this experience to this foreign country and came back with a completely different attitude to everything. He ended up, the story ends very well. He ended up marrying a Honduran, and he goes back to Honduras with her all the time. And he has a job in the GIS world that is involved traveling to all kinds of places. He's gone to Japan like 3 or 4 times, and to Hawaii, all paid for by his company, and he's broadened his horizons there. And so this field trip, this study abroad experience really launched him into all of what he's doing now. So that's the kind of thing that we do with field courses, study abroad, study away, and they really can be transformational for students.
Absolutely. I think of the students that I've brought to Africa on study abroad journeys, and they consider it to be life-changing as well. And students going to conferences as well consider those experiences to be very important. So again, it's getting the students to explore different places, and that means overcoming administrative hurdles and their own emotional reluctance, I suppose, at times to it. Explaining to them why it's so important and how captivating learning about the world can be. And as we think about learning about the world, let's go back to your own field experiences. You talked about the Pacific Islands. We're going to go back to the former Soviet Union. Let's talk about your experiences there, before you became a bona fide geographer.
But when I was masquerading as a kind of pseudo geographer back in those days, as I said, I lived in Finland, in Rovaniemi, which is in the Arctic Circle in Lapland, and it was only just 100 or 2 miles from the Soviet or Russian border. And it was at a time when the late Soviet Union, 1988, 1989, was kind of fragmenting, and there were already signs of dissolution and decay. And the Finns I was working with at this Arctic Center Institute, they had some connections with Soviet scientists, and we got invitations to visit them and do this kind of collaborative, hands across the border kind of work. And so I was able to join this small Finnish group of about 4 or 5 Finnish scientists, and we took our first trip over there. We drove, and we got to the Kola Peninsula, which was our focus area. It seems like Murmansk, Apatiti, that part, well above the Arctic Circle.
Right. I was going to say that's really far north.
It is very heavily. It's the most heavily militarized part of the Soviet Union or Russia today. In fact, many have said it's the most militarized place in the world. It's Murmansk is an ice-free port. It's a major Soviet naval base, submarine base, shipping and fishing area. So this big city, but also a lot of rural areas in remote Russian Lapland. So we had this experience going there. And our very first trip, we were actually detained by Soviet police for entering a closed city. But it ended up without a problem for us. We just had to spend a couple hours at a Soviet police station getting an insider's view of Soviet law enforcement and bureaucracy. But it ended well, and we were able to make multiple trips again. I remember I got to know a lot of locals. It was a time when I was in my 20s, and I got to know a lot of locals. I mean, just a lot of local workers, professors, academicians. I met people who were soldiers, sailors, KGB agents, gangsters. I knew kind of a big cross section of late Soviet society. And then, of course, things changed when the Soviet Union dissolved, and we still had our connections, and we were going back, several times a year for these visits and some expeditions into timber growing areas or just out into the forest, looking a lot at what environmental damage was taking place from all of this industrialization of the Kola Peninsula, a lot of nickel smelting and things like that with no environmental controls whatsoever. And so we went on some expeditions out to remote areas to look into that. And so I maintained those connections during the time when the Soviet Union dissolved and transitioned into the emergent Russia. It was fun times. It was you could kind of get around and do everything. And I always found everybody in Russia very hospitable, never had a bad experience in 9 or 10 trips there, sometimes for 2 months at a time. And I really enjoyed that. It was kind of the adventurous life in my 20s. And just will always look back to those experiences and wish I could do something similar now.
Well, there are things that you are doing now, and you're also But it seems like in a lot of ways, aside from taking students on field trips and field courses and teaching, as well as engaging in research and publication, you're serving the discipline in an administrative capacity. You were a president of the Association of Pacific Coast Geographers and contribute much to other geographical societies as well, like the California Geographical Society. Would you just offer a few words on why this is important? Why contributing to a professional organization devoted to the discipline is important?
Well, these are organizations that bring people together. This is the chance for you to get together with people you don't see on a regular basis, exchange ideas, learn about new things, have a kind of social interaction that you may not get at your home university or with different people, all of whom have some interest in the field of geography. It's a chance to bring your own students, a chance to see other people's students, and to see the excitement that they feel about having completed a creative piece of research and then present it. And many of these students get awards that these societies provide for travel or for the best paper or poster, and to see those students' excitement as they get an award or a prize for something is really very appealing to see. So that's why been heavily involved in a lot of different academic societies. I like that feeling of community that those organizations bring for geographers.
Well, I think it's great, and you've certainly done quite a bit. And yes, the impact it makes on students is tremendous. With about a minute to go here, I'm going to ask you to consider students in terms of pondering your background and offering perhaps a bit of advice for prospective undergraduate or graduate students in geography. Can you offer some input and insight?
Well, I would give three pieces of advice. First, seize opportunities that are presented to you. That opportunity may never come again, and if you don't grab it when you have that chance, you may lose it. That's how I ended up in Finland. I seized an opportunity to go to a particular conference. So if I hadn't done that, my whole life would have been different. So seizing opportunities when they're there, and don't just make excuses like, well, I have to do this, I have to do that. Like, think this is something that's not going to happen again. I need to jump on this. So seizing opportunities. Secondly, never lose a sense of adventure. Of all disciplines, geography is about adventure. It's about going to do things, whether you're doing something at home that's very creative and you're doing a computer modeling and discovering something, or whether you're out like Indiana Jones out in the field in some remote and exotic place. You still have maintain that sense of adventure. So never lose your sense of adventure. And the third thing I would say is never stop asking questions. Maintain that sense of curiosity. Keep asking about things. Keep learning.
Mike, those are profound words, and they are much appreciated. Want to thank you once again for being willing to share your thoughts and your background on this episode of Conversation with a Geographer, and also thank you for all you've done for our discipline.
Well, thank you, Mike, for inviting me here. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you for all the work you've done in documenting the history of geography.
Well, I appreciate your kind words as well. This concludes this episode of Conversation with a Geographer. Thank you.